All right, guys, welcome back to the Starting Good Social Enterprise Virtual Summit 2018. Thank you so much for tuning in today and joining us. This summit is all about giving you access to the ideas, inspiration, and insights you need to either start good or start doing more good this year. From March 19th to the 31st, we'll be sharing with you interviews, actionable presentations, and other insights from 30 plus founders, change makers, and doers in the social innovation space from all around the world. First off, this event is hosted by Start Some Good, the crowdfunding and innovation platform for change makers. Also, this has all been made possible by a great set of sponsors, media, and community partners. First off, thanks to our sponsors, ING Dreamstarter, Parramatta City Council, the Foundation for Young Australians, and Digital Storytellers. Thank you as well to our media partner, The Guardian, who helped us get the word out about this initiative. And a huge shout out to our 30 amazing community partners from all around the world who have rallied behind this initiative. Finally, we hope you enjoy your presentation today. Feel free to tweet at us using the Twitter hashtag #StartingGood18. and to connect with us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Welcome back to the Starting Good Summit, and I'm really excited about our guest for the current session. He's an Australian who's equally well known in the United States, and that's Peter. He's an Australian moral philosopher. He's written a number of influential books in the social impact, social change sector, from his first book on animal liberation to more recently The Life You Can Save, Acting Now to End World Poverty, and The Most Good You Can Do, How Effective Altruism is Changing Ideas About Living Ethically, which has since spawned quite a vibrant movement exploring how it is that we can make the greatest difference and what is the meaning of effective altruism. And that's what I'm excited to explore today. So thank you so much, Peter, for joining us. I really appreciate it.
You're very welcome. I'm happy to be with you.
Before we dive into your more recent work, I really like to go back to the very beginning for people and kind of discover in a way what attracted you to the whole field of moral philosophy and you know, the whole exploration that you've been on for decades now of how it is that we can live a good life, how it is that we can contribute to a better world and a reduction of suffering. What was it, do you think, in your upbringing or past that kind of attracted you towards this exploration of journey?
So I think I was interested in getting into debates with people, even at high school, and having some good arguments about not necessarily so much what was personally the right thing to do, but at that time it was more political ideas, I suppose. And you know, I came of age in the generation that was involved with the protests against the Vietnam War, and obviously there are ethical issues in that, and the civil rights movement in the United States. So then I started doing philosophy at university. I didn't know much about it, but it seemed interesting. And within philosophy, there are many areas that don't have any connection with everyday life, you know, discussing deep metaphysical questions or questions about logic and philosophy of mind. But clearly it's ethics and political philosophy that do engage with how we live as individuals and how we should form a society. So those were the areas that I naturally gravitated towards because of the fact that I guess I wanted to stay involved with those questions that I discussed before. So it all went on from there. And I think I was fortunate in that philosophy itself was moving in the late 60s and early 1970s to being more applied, to not just being a matter of analysis of the meanings of words, as it had been anyway in English language philosophy in the 1950s and early 1960s, but actually getting into some of the deeper issues of the times.
I love that. I'm a philosophy graduate myself, undergraduate.
Okay.
But I used to get a lot of a lot of my friends doing more quote unquote vocational degrees during university, teasing me about enjoy unemployment and so on. And I used to argue quite strenuously at the time that I was getting the most vocational degree because the world is moving too fast to simply learn a kind of
right.
of knowledge, and said you need to, the only thing that was going to be relevant in the future was to be able to kind of analyze the world and debate, as you say, and argue. And I certainly think that's stood me in good stead. Do you think it's important that do you think that philosophy should be a universal part of our education system, and do we do a good enough job at the moment, do you think, in getting people to engage in kind of real questions and debate and those sorts of skills and ways of thinking during their education?
I think we're doing more of it. Different countries have different systems. When I went to high school in Australia, you couldn't take philosophy at high school. Now there are options now to take it in the later years of high school, and some people are doing it. But I suppose we did do, even then, some sort of clear thinking, as it was called, and that's useful. I think it's very useful for people to be taught a little bit about thinking clearly, especially in these days of fake news and misinformation. It's good to have some skills to sort that out yourself. And yes, I certainly would like some of that to be taught everywhere, but I would also like people to be students in high school, or perhaps even earlier. There's some evidence that you can study philosophical questions in primary school, and it has benefits for the way you think in general. So I think, yes, people should be encouraged to ask those questions about how should I live, what's the right thing to do, how do I know? Those sorts of questions are good ones to teach at quite an early age.
Now I'm really excited to talk about the ideas surrounding effective altruism. For people who haven't previously been exposed to the idea, could you summarize what is effective altruism?
Sure. So effective altruism is both a philosophy and a social movement. The philosophy is that of saying, I want to do some good for the world. Maybe it's not the only thing I want to do. Effective altruists don't have to be saints. They don't have to be altruistic in every thought, word, and deed. But at least a part of what I want to do is to leave the world a better place, and perhaps more than that. Insofar as I'm going to put some of my resources into making the world a better place, time, money, skills, whatever it might be, I want to use them as effectively as possible, so that I maximize the impact that I can have with whatever I'm putting into it. And so that's the effective part of it. That it's not just enough to be well-intentioned. It's really important to make sure that what you're doing is effective in bringing about good in the world. So that's the philosophy. And the social movement, which is less than 10 years old, I would say now, is an emerging group of people, mostly millennials, who want to make that an important part of their life, who are forming organizations and places online where you can discuss what's the best way to do that, and encourage other people to think about being effective. Most people are altruistic to some extent, but encouraging people to make that more important, do more of it, but also to make sure that what you do is highly effective.
I know this is the question that tends to come up, or one of the challenges of effective altruism is that it forces a consideration of the balance between very different types of issues and very different types of, I guess, beneficiaries, both in terms of geography, scale, and even time frame now versus the future. How do you help people grapple with this kind of comparing unlike things? I can certainly understand that if it's just talking about number of people out of poverty, or an example you give in your TED talk is helping one person achieve greater mobility through a seeing eye dog versus actually helping hundreds or thousands of people see for the same investment level. That seems, very clear, very easy. But comparing, your previous involvement in animal rights, for instance, I'm sure people sometimes struggle with the balance between animal lives and Australian lives, or lives versus lives improved versus lives saved, and so on. How do you help people kind of think through these tough questions?
They're all very good questions and very difficult ones. If we start with the easier end of it, I mean, you talked about things that are quite comparable, like giving a blind person a seeing eye dog or restoring sight, and most people would agree that restoring sight is better. But then we might be comparing saving lives. So you can support the Against Malaria Foundation, which provides bed nets in areas where malaria is a killer, particularly of children. And you can save lives by doing that. It's not that expensive to save a child's life. But you might say, well, how do I compare that with, say, what we just mentioned, restoring sight for several people, maybe for the cost of saving one child's life. So that's one difficult question. And health economists have been working on that kind of issue because it's come up before. It comes up, for example, when you have a national health service or a national health insurance scheme like Medicare, and you say, well, what are the things that we should be putting money into? What are our priorities? Should we be putting more into neonatal intensive care, which saves the lives of premature babies but is pretty expensive? Or should we be putting more into helping people with arthritic hips to get operations so that they can walk again? And they have a sort of a measure which is called a quality adjusted life year, or sometimes a disability adjusted life year, which tries to investigate people's choices, people's trade-offs, by asking them hypothetical questions. How many years of life would you be prepared to give up to be able to walk again? That sort of question. It's not a perfect methodology, but it gets you some of the distance there. But then, as you pointed out, we can make that even more difficult. We can say, well, how about saving 10,000 chickens from having to endure life in a factory farm, which is a life of misery, I believe. And how do you compare that with helping one person to walk again, let's say? So I don't think anybody actually has the answer to that question. I've had a couple of students try and work on it. They, you can get a certain distance, but all you can say is, well, the current ratios might be something like this, and then give you some figures and consider how that compares with what you can achieve by donating to different organizations. So at some point, I think, I'm prepared to say, when people say, well, should I donate to reduce animal suffering or should I donate to reduce human suffering? And assuming that there's a greater quantity of animal suffering you could reduce for the same resources. I say, look, you have to decide that. That's, in a way, I'm not saying it's a subjective choice in a deep sense, but I'm just saying we don't have a method yet of knowing what animal suffering is like and how that compares. So, that's just one example, but obviously there are many more disparate areas where those comparisons are very difficult.
And so it does. So, effective altruism is not about a purely rationalist process. Would you agree? I mean, inevitably it does ultimately come down to, in these judgment calls, in these comparisons between things, into people's life experience and the things they care about more or less about are inevitably there in the consideration.
Yeah, effective altruists will be as rational as they possibly can within those areas where there are things to compare and there is good data. And then other cases, they'll just say, we don't have any of the kind of information here. We can't put ourselves inside the life of a chicken or a pig or a cow. And so we don't know how to compare that amount of suffering with human suffering. And this is my estimate of what it might be like. This is what I'm going to go for. But other people will make different judgments, and we don't have a means of resolving that difference at the moment.
And are you hopeful, or do you even believe it's possible that this could become the primary way in which the dominant approach to philanthropy that most people take? Or do you accept that certainly the crowdfunding world, which we're very involved with, we know that we teach people you have to engender an emotional response. If you want to raise money, certainly there can be facts and there should be evidence that what you're doing makes sense and so on, but no one will even get the evidence if you haven't first triggered an emotional response. So we kind of teach them a series of emotional hooks around how to do that. And one of the ones that people often don't think enough about, but it can be very powerful, is, for instance, the geography book. And so isn't it kind of just inevitable that people will, on some level, care more about local suffering than distant suffering, even if you can alleviate more suffering at greater distance for the same amount of money?
So firstly, it's sometimes said that effective altruists are sort of not emotionally involved in what they're doing, that they're sort of coldly rational. I think that's a caricature, a misconception. Effective altruists can be very emotionally involved in what they're doing because they're emotionally involved in the suffering of other people. And they just, on top of that emotional involvement, they get the point that if for the same amount of resources they could relieve the suffering of 10 people, rather than the similar suffering of just one, then that's a better thing to do. So there is definitely still emotional involvement, but it's controlled, you might say, or it's directed by rational thought. Now, with regard to the point you made about geography, I suppose, yes, we would expect people to continue to favour those close to them. But the question is, by what ratio? So if you think about the fact that you may live in a country, let's say, where the poverty line is $20,000, as many affluent countries, that might be around the figure. So to really make a substantial difference to the income of somebody who's on $20,000, sorry, to the well-being of someone who's on an income of $20,000, you would presumably need to give them, let's say, $10,000 so that they're significantly higher level, can now do things that they couldn't have done before. But if you then consider that there are people in the world who, according to World Bank's estimate of extreme poverty, there are hundreds of millions of people living on less than $2 a day, so let's say roughly $700 a year. So for that $10,000 that you might take to make somebody in an affluent country significantly better off, you could make 20 people significantly better off. Let's say 20 people who are on $700 a year. You could give them $500 each, and you'd be making a bigger difference to their lives than you would by giving $10,000 to the life of a wealthy American or Australian. So I don't think I think that ratio is just too glaring. I'm not denying that if you could give $1 here or $1 there and it would make a similar difference, you'd do it at home. But to think that you would want to benefit one person because they're your fellow citizen, whereas you could make a bigger difference to 20 people for the same resources, I think we ought to be able to educate people to think more broadly than that.
Mm. Yeah, one of the interesting examples I think of that is in climate change, where it's all one biosphere, it's all one climate, and so
Yep.
carbon, reducing the carbon anywhere is what needs to happen, and in some ways it's all broken up by country as part of perhaps the issue, but doing in a way any carbon reforestation projects, etc. in Australia is an inefficient way to do it compared to what you could get for the same money overseas. Do you think that those sorts of global challenges will lead to, and do you think, it feels like we're maybe on a slow trajectory towards being more inclusive in our thinking from just our family groups and tribes and nations, and do you think we are going to enter on our way towards an age where it will be more common for people to think in truly global terms, in terms of our fellow global citizens, and will global crises like climate change be part of that process?
Yeah, I certainly do think that, and I've argued that in some of my books. I actually have a book called The Expanding Circle, which talks about exactly that expansion of the moral circle from the tribe to nowadays anyway, at least in official rhetoric, all humans, even if, as you say, that's not reflected in our actions, and hopefully eventually to all sentient beings. And Steven Pinker makes a related argument in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, where he also talks about that expansion outwards of the moral universe. So I do think we're on that path. I agree with you that problems like climate change, which are so inescapably global, are helping us to get to that place. But obviously, it's not a smooth path there. There's things that go up and down, and the upsurge of nationalism and populism, which is epitomized by Donald Trump and by Brexit, are both things that push in the opposite direction. And so I think, perhaps what they show is that you can't push people too far in that respect, and especially if it comes to admitting people of different background and different beliefs to your community, that immigration is something that you have to go carefully with. Otherwise you get this kind of reaction that has led to the election of people who I think are disastrous and were likely to turn against climate change, for instance, as Trump has done, just as they're likely to turn against immigration and asylum seekers.
I had the good fortune recently to watch Ai Weiwei's film on refugees, Human Flow. And I have to say, it did a brilliant job of conjuring in me this real sense of universality around this experience, and really got me thinking about the role of borders and nation states. And, you know, just because I happen to have been born here, do I have a greater right to now enjoy the privilege of being here than anyone else? You know, why couldn't someone decide that they want to be in Australia and turn up? Do you think, morally and philosophically, that do you believe in borders? Should people be able to live where they want to live? And would that would obviously be a form of greater equality as people shifted towards richer areas and think without? What are your thoughts on that, at least in a...
Well, I mean, I think, you know, if you postulate the question in an ideal sense, in the absence of constraints relating to politics, then you would say, sure, open borders is right. You know, the fact that I was born in this country doesn't give me any greater claim to live in it than anyone else. But I think that that's, as I say, that is politically a recipe for disaster. So I don't see that as happening. Yeah, that's right. You get this backlash. You get the election of people like Donald Trump. You know, you see it everywhere. You see the Brexit, of course. You know, the breakup or weakening of the European Union, which was a kind of open borders within Europe anyway. You get the election of governments like the Polish government, for instance, which is very anti-immigrant and pretty much anti-Europe as well. So I think this is happening everywhere, and really, you know, it's not just a matter of saying, you know, well, these politicians who are trying to stop open borders are racist or something of that sort. I think that we need to have some kind of control to assure people that we are not taking things too fast at a level that they're not prepared to accept.
I'm going to change gears slightly now and ask you about your thoughts on social enterprise, which is a theme. We do a lot of work with social enterprises. We are a social enterprise ourselves. The virtual summit has a lot of content around social enterprise. A lot of the language in effective altruism is very based on giving and donating, you know, and being thoughtful about who you give those funds to in order to do the most good. What are your thoughts on the role that social enterprise can play in helping this transition to a more just and equal world?
Right. Well, obviously, effective altruism is about being effective, and if it can be shown that starting a social enterprise is more effective than donating to a non-profit organisation, then we ought to help the social enterprise get started. It's going to depend, though, on exactly that comparison. And so far, while the effective altruism movement has done quite a lot of work in comparing one non-profit organisation with another, and is able to say, you know, you get good value for money if you donate to the Against Malaria Foundation, and you get less good value for money if you donate to you know, various other organisations. The Make-A-Wish Foundation is one that I've mentioned in some of my work as a less good value for money than, although it's emotionally appealing because it talks about sick kids and so on, you get much less value for money than you get from the Against Malaria Foundation, for example. So we can do that with non-profits, but I haven't seen much work that is saying, how do you compare that with social enterprises? And I suppose the reason for that is social enterprises are so diverse, and before going into a social enterprise, starting one up, it's very hard to know what kind of success you're going to have. But that's okay, you know, I mean, things have to be based on probability, but we still need to get some sort of idea of, suppose I have $100,000 that I'm prepared to donate this year, what are my chances of doing more good by investing it in a social enterprise than by donating it to some of the charities that the Life You Can Save recommends, for example. I don't know that anybody knows the answer to that.
That's true. Sorry? When you're at that point, I suspect when you're at that kind of moment, you have a quantity of cash to give to someone in return for social impact. Charities, I hope, would actually outperform before. Social enterprises have to do a whole range of things involved in the production and distribution of a good or service that inevitably means that they don't have the same, the same degree of funds, won't hit the ground necessarily. I guess the trade-off is between the reliance on ongoing inputs of cash versus potentially something that is self-sustaining. But I also wanted to, do you think kind of this is again still looking at people with their philanthropic activities, but of course they've spent another $100,000 that year, or maybe not that much. I know there's examples of people pledging to live on 30,000, but let's even say they get to choose how they're spending that 30,000 within a year as well. And certainly I would argue it's really important that people take the same thoughtfulness that you're talking about in kind of what they select on a day-to-day basis, and the signals that sends to the world around them through their consumption. And I think that's where I think social enterprises are not more effective than charities; they're more effective than businesses.
Right. Right.
Business
Okay.
as usual. Yeah.
Yes.
And so they allow you to align the money you're living off as well as the money you're giving away, one hopes, in a way that
Right. Right. So it depends what the social enterprise is. Obviously, if the social enterprise is something that provides me with buying choices where I am, then clearly that's something that I can do with the money that I'm living, and that may be a highly effective thing to do. But of course, there are also social enterprises that are providing services for people in developing countries rather than for me, and
yes, that's true.
That's maybe more closely comparable to the NGO that's working in a developing country.
Interesting. Yeah, good point. Before we run out of time, I also just want to ask you, I guess, about the role that you've played in fostering and helping grow this movement around the ideas contained in the Effective Altruism book and the other work you've done. What's it been like for you? I know you've been involved in founding organizations in the past as well, and many of the people who are watching this are themselves either kind of partway along the journey of founding things and running things, or aspiring to do so. What did it look like for you to kind of take those ideas, a public intellectual, good at sharing ideas, but then to actually start trying to put them in practice in terms of building a movement and inspiring other people to act?
Yeah, it's very different. Obviously, I start out from the ideas, but in some cases, I have felt that I wanted to get hands-on involved. When I wrote Animal Liberation, there weren't really organisations that were taking that more radical stance about animals. So when I came back to Australia after a period of study and work overseas, I did work. I helped to found Animal Liberation in Australia, the organisation, and then the organisation that today is known as Animals Australia, I was also a co-founder of. So it's actually quite rewarding to see these organisations grow and thrive and have an impact. And now I'm involved with a global organisation called The Life You Can Save that sprung up from the book I wrote with that title, that is trying to encourage people to be more effective in their giving relating to global poverty, and has a website where we recommend the most effective charities and try to encourage that. I'm less hands-on with that. I was very fortunate to find a volunteer, unpaid executive director with a lot of experience, a very successful retail career, experience in doing that kind of thing. But I enjoy staying connected with it and looking at the decisions and the policies that they make. So I do find that rewarding. Of course, it takes time away from the purely research and philosophical writing, but I think it's actually good for me to be more hands-on involved in the world and to see how some of these ideas play out when you do try to put them into practice.
Yeah, I do think there's only so much you can learn if you don't indeed go and try and put things into practice. Yep. So on that, has there been anything that, as you've put your ideas into practice, particularly around the Effective Altruism movement or the Life You Can Save, these more recent efforts and new kind of more online organizations, has there been something that has surprised you or a learning for you that you did not anticipate when you began?
Well, I guess there are a number of different things that have surprised me. When I started in the animal movement, I guess I was a bit surprised by how defensive people were of their turf. I had thought that people concerned about animals would all work together reasonably harmoniously against animal abusers. But no, I found that some people were actually quite ready to attack other animal groups because they weren't taking quite the right line as they were. it seemed to me, looking at it, that the arguments were not really so much about, you do better taking this line than that, although obviously there was a bit of that, but there was also a bit about, this is my organization, and I'm trying to build this organization. So people do get territorial about organizations as they might about actually defending territory. But that's a lesson that I absorbed quite some time ago. Actually, I think it's slightly less true in the effective altruism movement, which is interesting. I'm not quite sure why, but maybe it's sort of newer. But people do seem to work together somewhat more harmoniously there, obviously, not in every respect. Yeah, and then just seeing what people respond to is always interesting. I think we are a lot more scientific now in trying to see what kinds of appeals people respond to and how to get people thinking about the issues we want them to think about. So there's more connection with behavioral psychology and behavioral economics now than there was when I was involved with animal liberation more 30 or 40 years ago.
Mm. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned behavioral economics. In some ways, that's the study of, the ways in which we're less rational than perhaps were claimed in the past, even while you're trying to push people towards acting in a more rational way in one area of their life. Very importantly, I'm interested as someone who's obviously spent a lot of time, I've spent a lot of time in the US, and it's come up a couple of times in our conversations that there's obviously been some steps backwards in terms of the direction we would like the world to go with both Brexit, but also Trump and so on, and this real reaction, this very emotive reaction to some of the forces that are affecting us, and people retreating, I think, back into more kind of tribal identities and so on as a result of that. In looking at all of this and being someone who thinks deeply around this and has a good, a perspective of having been focused on this over a period of time, are you hopeful? How do you feel about the future?
Yeah, I guess I'm generally an optimist, although I recognise that things go, they don't go straightforwardly, progressively. They go, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, and we seem to be undergoing the step back period at the moment. But I was very gloomy when George W. Bush was elected president in 2000, and we survived 8 years of George W. Bush, and we got 8 years of Barack Obama, which I thought was a lot better. I'm hoping we won't have to survive 8 years of Donald Trump, but I'm hopeful that we will survive 4, and maybe we'll move on to something better after that. But it's going to take time, and yeah, I think you have to look at the dips as well as the peaks.
That's right. Well, just a final question that I always love to ask people, just in general in my life, but certainly when I have the opportunity to speak to people I admire as much as yourself, is book recommendations, or films if you prefer, or what would you recommend in terms of what's influenced your thinking that you think would be beneficial for the rest of us to also dive into?
Well, just to...
Of course.
Sorry?
In addition to your books, of course.
Yeah, thank you. Right, yeah, okay. In terms of, we're just talking about maintaining an optimistic frame of mind, and I already mentioned Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which I think does that, and he has a more recent book on enlightenment, which does that as well. So that's interesting. And speaking of enlightenment and such things, there's quite a bit about altruism in the work of Mathieu Ricard, who's a French, well, originally was trained as a French scientist and then became a Buddhist and an associate of the Dalai Lama. He has a big book called Altruism, which has a lot of, brings together a lot of different kinds of wisdom, Eastern wisdom as well as science about altruism. Happily recommend that.
Something's just come over our camera. Sorry.
Sorry?
Something's come over your webcam. Could you maybe wave your hand towards the webcam?
Oh, it's a fly.
Oh, there we go.
Animals are interfering with us. A fly just landed on my webcam.
That's really funny. I could suddenly went back. It was a fly.
I noticed there was a fly buzzing around, but I never thought it would actually land on the webcam.
It's enormous, it seems like.
It looks big there. It's actually quite a small fly. This is Australia and it's summer, so we have flies.
That's right. So fantastic. Anything else you want to add? Final thoughts to share?
Nothing immediately that comes to mind, I think. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, we're at the end of our allotted time, and I don't want to keep you any longer, but I'm very grateful for you taking this time and having a chat. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you so much.
Good. Great to talk to you.
Take care. All right.
Thanks
Bye.
very much. Good. Bye.